Hello students, welcome back. Today we are going to begin our second lecture on the Old Colonial System, which existed from basically 1660 to 1763. So during that period, which is approximately a century, right? During that time, the American colonies were an integral and important part of the British Empire. The colonials relied on their mother country for protection, security, and trade, and England relied on her American colonies for trade as well and commerce in order to maintain an economic advantage over other European powers. So in this system, both sides established a reasonable working relationship that operated relatively well. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. This was partly because they never had a defined power structure. And what I mean by that is they never determined for certain where authority lay on certain issues. This is especially true with the power to tax. Now, if something happened that made both sides have to define this power structure, that could and would destroy their working relationship and lead us into the American Revolution. So, by 1640, England had established colonies in two places in the New World. There were colonies in the South. This is the area around Virginia on the Chesapeake Bay and Maryland. And there were also colonies in New England. And we've talked about these before. They were the beginnings of 4 states: Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. This slide here perhaps shows you the different colonies a little bit better than the previous one. You can see the southern colonies. At the beginning, again, it was just Virginia and Maryland. The others will be added with time. And then the New England colonies at the top. We'll talk about the middle ones later. So between 1640 and 1660, we talked about England was in crazy chaos because of the Puritan Revolution. And so during those 20 years, no new colonies were settled. But then in 1660, with the restoration of Charles II, the ruling family was returned to the throne, the Church of England was made the established religion again, and at this point, the British government looked at what they had in America and realized they needed to do something to make it more profitable. They decided they needed a system to develop the area and to create an empire that would benefit them. So this is what leads to the establishment of the Old Colonial System, which begins around 1660. Now this meant 2 things. Number 1, this meant a second wave of colonies. So after the first wave of colonies that came before 1640, we have that 20-year gap without any new colonies. However, if you look at this map, you can see that before the middle colonies were developed, there was nothing connecting the New England colonies to the southern colonies. So there was a need to link those areas up. So, in the period between 1660 and 1690, 6 more English settlements were created. We get New York and New Jersey. Those were claimed by the Dutch initially, but the English came in and took them over fairly quickly. We have Pennsylvania, which was a haven for the Quakers. We have Delaware, which ultimately these linked the New England and Southern colonies up. We also get North and South Carolina that were created to protect the colonies from the Spanish in Florida. And that last colony down there, Georgia, that was settled much later in 1732. Now, the idea of mercantilism, this is a set of economic ideas. It's the basic belief that the total of the world's gold and silver was essentially fixed, that all nations were in economic competition with one another. It was basically a zero-sum game. In this competition, every country's goal was a favorable balance of trade, or to export or sell more than you import or buy. Colonies helped this process because they allowed a country to get basic resources that they could not grow themselves, like tobacco or sugar, to get those basic resources from within their own empire, so they don't have to go buy it from another country that they're in competition with. So instead of England having to buy those goods from France, they could instead buy them from their own colonies. Also, the mother country could sell their goods to their colonies. Both sides of this meant that money remained within the empire rather than going outside of it. Now, to enact these economic ideals, to enact mercantilism, and to make sure that their colonies supported this favorable balance of trade, countries would enforce trade regulations. So for the first time, England started putting restrictions on the American colonies with the Navigation Acts. Now, the Navigation Acts were the practical application of the predominant economic theory of the time. Put another way, mercantilism was the economic idea, and the Navigation Acts is how they made mercantilism work for them. It's the practical application of mercantilism. Now, there are three main parts to the Navigation Acts. First of all goods imported into England or her colonies had to be carried on a British ship, and 3/4 of the crew had to be English citizens. Second, key colonial products that could not be grown in England, such as coffee, sugar, tobacco, rice, fur, these were put on a numbered list. This list was called the Enumerated Articles. And all of these items had to be exported directly to Great Britain before they could go to any other country. Meaning the mother country had to have the first shot at buying these goods from the colonies if she wanted. Also, when these enumerated goods reached a port in England, custom duties were put on them to promote English trade. Now, these custom duties were placed on goods not to earn revenue, but rather to regulate trade, sort of like the tariff is now. So custom duties were placed on imported goods in order to promote domestic industry, to promote goods created within the mother country, within the colonies. Now, virtually all manufactured goods, wherever they came from, had to go through England first on their way to the colonies. So if the colonists wanted French wine or lace, that French wine or lace had to go through England first. Once there, the British would put custom duties on the items to make them more expensive. This discouraged colonials from buying foreign manufactured goods because it made British goods cheaper, because British goods didn't have those custom duties. So it was a way again to promote domestic manufacturing and to make foreign goods more expensive. Now, some people say that these Navigation Acts were the beginning of the American Revolution. But I want you to look at that date up there, 1660 to 1663. Now, even though we haven't talked about the American Revolution yet, I have a feeling that you guys know it happened in the 1770s, right? So, this is more than 100 years before the rebellion. More than 100 years. So, while these may look and sound bad on paper, they actually did not make a big difference in the colonies at the time, and that's because of the colonial economy. Now, the colonial economy at the time meant that most people in the colonies were subsistence farmers, meaning they grew and made all of their own stuff in order to survive. So most people in the colonies weren't going out and buying and selling a lot of products. They were subsisting. The ones that did move beyond subsistence farming and began growing cash crops usually wanted to sell those crops to England anyway, because England had the strongest economy, the best trade, and the best navy in the world. England also had the best manufacturing in the world at the time. So colonists would have probably bought from them anyway. They had the best things to sell. However, some colonies did fit into this colonial economy better than others. So the South, the southern United States, fit into the system really well because in the South, the southern colonies were growing cash crops, and they wanted to sell these cash crops directly to England anyway. Again, this is things like tobacco, sugar, cotton. Now, in New England, they engaged in commerce or trade. They engaged in shipbuilding, in manufacturing. Those industries put them in direct competition with England. So, although New Englanders could make money by following the Navigation Acts, they could make even more money if they didn't follow them. So, from the very beginning, they ignored the rules they didn't like. They started evading the laws because it was in their economic interest to do so. Now, examples of New England evasions of the laws are when those enumerated articles were loaded onto a ship in New England. Remember, the merchants were supposed to stop at an English port before they could go and sell to France or French colonies. So, to get around having to sail all the way to London, colonists would load up in one colonial port, let's say Boston. They'd load up their goods in Boston. And then, instead of going to London, they would go to another colonial port, let's say Charleston, because technically that is an English port. Remember, these are English colonies. And then they would go wherever they wanted without stopping in England proper. Well, the British, of course, figured out what was going on, and they got really sick of this. So much so that in 1673, they started putting custom collectors in the colonies to collect custom duties before the goods got onto a ship. This was the first time the English had to station forces in the colonies to watch the colonials. Now, when they got there, the custom collectors realized and told English officials that the colonists were breaking all the Navigation Acts everywhere, all over the place. So this led to England trying to change the system to better enforce the laws. Now, Charles II, the former King of England, he died, and he was replaced by his brother, James II, in 1685. Now, James II was the first Catholic monarch in England since Queen Mary back in the 1550s. He would also be the last Catholic monarch. He decided that he was going to reorganize all of the northern colonies so they would benefit the mother country better. So, in 1686, he ordered the creation of what was called the Dominion of New England. The Dominion of New England. The purpose of this was to make the Navigation Acts more properly enforced. This was essentially a super colony in which all of New England was rolled into one, meaning the New England colonies lost their separate identities, their separate charters, their colonial assemblies, and were run by one person appointed by the king, a man named Edmund Andros. When Andros came over to New England in 1686, the colonials were really unhappy because he was the representative of the king, so whatever he said was law. Going against Andros was an act of rebellion. He was stationed in Boston, and Andros and his lieutenants, they levied taxes without the consent of the general court. They even jailed and fined residents that protested the taxation. However, the colonists are going to get really lucky here, because 2 years after Andros came over, in 1688, there was a revolution in England. This revolution was called the Glorious Revolution. This was a completely English affair, right, taking place in England alone, where the Protestants in the country overthrew James II and his Catholic wife because they had a son. And again, England did not want a Catholic monarchy. So they brought in Mary. Now, Mary was James's daughter from a previous marriage. And Mary was married to William, who was the king of the Netherlands. They were Protestants, not Catholics. Now, it's called the Glorious Revolution because there was no bloodshed. There was no bloodshed. James II, he simply fled to France. No one was beheaded. So William and Mary were put on the throne. Now, when the colonials in Massachusetts heard about this, they immediately rebelled against Edmund Andros. They put Andros in jail, and they undid everything he had done, reverting to their former government under the General Court. All the other colonies soon followed suit. Now, when the British government, under William and Mary, found out what was going on in the colonies, they were confused. They said, "What the hell's going on over there?" Well, the colonists told them that they were simply getting rid of the puppet government that had been set up by James II, that they were helping the revolution and supporting their new king and queen, William and Mary. Well, somehow they bought it. The colonists got away with this for a while, and in 1691, all the colonies went back to governing themselves. Now, generally speaking, most of the problems were worked out between the colonists and the King and Queen of England through the colonial representative assemblies and the governor. Still, there was occasional low-key conflict with the mother country. Now, these were all of the conflict was strictly low-key because at this point, the colonists could not be and did not want to be independent. They saw themselves as British citizens and they wanted and needed the British government's protection. But what these conflicts stemmed from was the fact that the colonists were constantly pushing for their own interest, pushing to get more control over their affairs. And on the flip side, England was pushing for more and more control of the colony. So it's really about where the control lied. So where the conflicts came into play was when the royal governors and the colonial assemblies disagreed on particular issues. Now, the colonists pushed for power through their representative assemblies. But their strength was put in check by the governor. And the governor, remember, was assigned by the King of England. The governor had power to determine when and where the legislative assembly would meet. The governor could adjourn their sessions, could appoint and remove officials, could command the militia and the naval forces, and could grant pardons. Now, to counter that, the colonial assemblies could initiate legislation, and most importantly, the colonial assemblies had the power of the purse. That means they had control of the money. This ultimately made the legislature more powerful because if the governor needed money for something, needed to raise an army, he would need the colonial assembly to raise that money for him. So as the colonists expanded their power and influence by passing laws and enacting other routine business, they began setting precedents over where the authority lay. There were two things colonists agreed that England had all power over. Colonists agreed that England had the power over going to war and the power to regulate trade through custom duties or tariffs. On the other hand, the colonists insisted that they too had certain rights. Most notably, they said that taxing was in their control. Before 1763, Great Britain never taxed the colonists. Rather, they put custom duties on goods to regulate trade, but they never taxed the colonists before 1763. So for the most part, colonists lived in the old colonial system doing pretty well for themselves for a couple of reasons. Britain had the biggest navy in the world and one of the best militaries, which the colonists needed that protection. And second, any part of the navigation acts that bothered the colonists, they simply didn't follow. They smuggled a lot of stuff into and out of America, especially in the Massachusetts Bay Area. They also engaged in bribery. The British didn't pay their custom collectors very much, so the colonists would simply bribe the custom collectors. There were even set and understood prices for bribery. Now, did the British know this was going on? Of course they knew. This was called salutary neglect, meaning both sides were doing pretty well in the system, so why bother changing it? The British were making a lot of money off the colonists, and the colonists were perfectly comfortable as well. So if the system was working so well, why change the system? So therefore, the British allowed the colonies a lot of leeway, a lot of freedoms, because they were doing so well. Now, the economic results of the old colonial system up until 1763 was that it worked to the reasonable benefit of both sides. England knew the colonists were not obeying every rule, but during this period, and largely because of their American colonies, Britain became the world's greatest economic and military power. And although the colonists were bothered by the navigation acts and tariffs, they were okay with this system because they were still making money. Some people were even thriving, and because they needed the protection of Britain. The colonies as a whole were thriving too. In 1650, there were only 50,000 colonists. In 1650, there were only 50,000 colonists. By 1770, there were 2 million. So this was a working relationship to the reasonable benefits of both sides. It would, however, deteriorate between the colonists in Britain when both sides were forced to define the power structure between them. But we'll talk about that in the next lecture.